What about Momoshiki? Things aren't settled with them yet, are they? From what I saw earlier, you still can't control your karma. About 2 years ago, when my teacher and I fought code together, I used my karma for the first time since I'd left the village. That's when I sensed it. Something similar to the feeling I got whenever Momoshiki possessed me. What? A feeling where I stopped being who I am and started dying while still conscious and aware. Since then, I haven't used karma once. Hey, how's it going? In today's video, we'll be talking about Momoshiki. More specifically, we're going to be addressing the topic on why he hasn't appeared in Two Blue Vortex. Certainly with all the chaos happening in the world, Momoshiki would have saw it as a golden opportunity to take advantage of the situation, especially with the Shinju around. This video will contain spoilers for the manga. You have been warned. With that being said, let's get started. So there's a few things we need to look at prior to making the final conclusion on why Momoshiki hasn't appeared. And I feel the answer actually lies in part 1 of the series. So the first thing we need to look at is the nature of the Karma Seal and Boruto's current biology. Then we need to take a closer look at Boruto's death and how specifically he was resurrected after the events of Boruto chapter 66. Finally, we need to analyze the after effects of Boruto's revival and Momoshiki's nature and personality as he's resided within Boruto's soul. As of the recording of this video, we are 20 chapters deep into part 2 of the series, and we haven't seen anything from Momoshiki as of late. He hasn't reached out to Boruto mentally to speak with him, and he hasn't tried to hijack Boruto's body either, which is very out of character for someone like Momoshiki considering everything he's done in part 1 of the series. At face value, it would appear that Boruto finally managed to seal Momoshiki away for good. But as we learned in chapter 15 of Two Blue Vortex, that simply just isn't the case. So where is he? I have a couple of ideas on what actually happened to Momoshiki during the time skip, and we'll be going over each of these ideas in this video. I believe I have gathered a decent amount of evidence to back up these claims as well, and we'll be going through that soon enough. We learned what Momoshiki's goals consisted of back in Boruto chapter 54 part 1. Kawaki went through 80% of the karma extraction process and made him eligible to be a proper sacrifice for the Ten Tails. Momoshiki had the desire to feed Kawaki to the Ten Tails to harvest a chakra fruit in hopes of obtaining power. This would of course bring forth the darkest timeline, which aligns directly with what the Shinju's secondary goal is in Two Blue Vortex. In chapter 46 of part 1, Amato breaks down the nature of the Karma Seal to Boruto and the others. Amato explains that Boruto's karma was embedded with the soul of Momoshiki. Amato was being completely transparent as he was explaining this, and here is why. It was evident by him not seeing smoking in that exchange with the different characters. Smoking serves as a metaphor and an indicator throughout Boruto part 1 and part 2 whether Amato is being transparent and honest or if he's being deceptive. Karma is a shinjutsu that behaves like a program which stores compressed data of an Otsutsuki and extracts that data over time onto a new vessel. It's similar to an installer software on a Windows operating system. That software will affect the behavior and characteristics of that OS over time as the data is being downloaded. This is the fate of all vessels. Their data, or rather their DNA, will be overridden by the backup data within the Karma Seal. Once the karmification process is completed, the vessel will cease to exist and the Otsutsuki will fully revive themselves. There are 2 loopholes to get around the karmification process. There's the natural one that Kawaki went through when Ishiki revived in Jigen's vessel, and then there's the unnatural or unorthodox loophole that Boruto experienced, which we will cover in a moment. An Otsutsuki can have multiple vessels, but the moment the Otsutsuki revives in one of those vessels, the Karma Seal will disappear for the remaining vessels still around. And the explanation is quite simple. There cannot be duplicates of the same soul. Every soul is unique. But this is great for the former vessel that no longer has to worry about the Otsutsuki resurrecting inside of them because they basically hit the genetic lottery at that point. But something quite different happened in chapter 66 of part 1. Kawaki managed to successfully kill Boruto. Boruto prior to his death was also about 80% done with his Karma Seal extraction process. We learned in chapter 67 the extent of Boruto's injuries and how he was able to survive. Part of Boruto's lungs and heart were completely destroyed. In addition to that, Boruto had lost a significant amount of blood. The average person would have been dead in seconds if they were in Boruto's position. Momoshiki's hand was forced at this point, and he made a very unorthodox decision to keep his one and only vessel alive. Boruto was specifically 82% complete in his karma extraction process. Momoshiki had decided to use the remaining 18% of that data to replicate Boruto's damaged cells and tissues. Basically, the parts that were intended for Momoshiki's body for his resurrection were used for Boruto instead, which in turn made Boruto 100% Otsutsuki without the drawback of Momoshiki erasing Boruto from existence. Which sounds great on paper, but then Amato points out a very obvious issue that still remains in chapter 68. Boruto may not have to worry about resurrecting Momoshiki anymore, but who's to say Momoshiki wouldn't still be able to take over his body from time to time? They're basically two souls that exist in the same body, and neither one of them can get rid of the other. Momoshiki can't resurrect inside of Boruto anymore, and Boruto can't get rid of the Karma Seal because he is Momoshiki's only vessel. But it's not just the fact that Momoshiki can still take over Boruto's body that's a concern. There's also the different side effects that we start to see in chapter 75 of part 1. Boruto and Momoshiki's thoughts actually begin crossing over with each other. Boruto even compares it to that of the mind transfer jutsu, which he later realized that it wasn't. Momoshiki's thoughts were actually in his head. And this wasn't even the last side effect that Boruto experienced after his revival in part 1. So outside of his control, Boruto without his Karma Seal activated randomly awakens Momoshiki's Byakugan. Apparently Momoshiki's Byakugan is actually special because it granted Boruto access to seeing the future, which actually came into existence in chapter 79 of the series. Unlike Kashin Koji's prescience, Momoshiki's power lets him see the existing future that's currently running parallel to the timeline, which are events that the story is actually leading to and not just possibilities of which way the timeline can go in. These moments are not clear because these images are shown without context. So it's up to Momoshiki or even Boruto to decipher that information. And things get even stranger. So when we get to chapter 78, which is the final chapter in the series as of the recording of this video, where Momoshiki takes over Boruto's mind post-resurrection, we see that Momoshiki was actually able to strengthen Boruto's damaged eye enough to the point where it actually opened and he was able to see through it like nothing had happened. He also releases Kawaki, but there was always something that bothered me about this scene when he allowed Kawaki to escape. And it's the fact that Momoshiki's horn is nowhere to be found at any point in this scene. Momoshiki emerged in Boruto's body on 3 separate occasions prior to chapter 78, and each time he had the common feature of that horn when he possessed Boruto. So in chapter 43, Momoshiki appeared to fight Boro, and this was his first ever manifestation from within Boruto's body. Momoshiki appeared, of course, because Boro was willing to kill his one and only vessel. Appearance-wise, Boruto's headband hit his neck when the horn emerged from his forehead, which indicated that Momoshiki was fully in control. The same thing happened in chapter 54 when Momoshiki came back after he saw Ishiki's death and found a golden opportunity to make Kawaki be his sacrifice to the Ten Tails. He also manifests a horn in this encounter as well. Momoshiki also appeared in chapter 65 after Boruto had a heart attack and couldn't keep up with Code with his white Karma Seal. He saw Code as competition, of course, because they basically had the same goal, but only one of them could eat the chakra fruit realistically, and so they had to be against each other. Momoshiki appears again, but this time he has a broken horn after the events of the Ishiki conflict. So why doesn't Momoshiki have the horn now, when every other time he has appeared, the horn was present? What's also interesting is that this is a particular form that we've seen of Boruto's Karma Seal before. it's the exact same version of karma that we saw when Boruto took Amato's drugs and activated it to fight Code for the first time in the series. The significance behind this particular karma state that Boruto is taking is that it completely blurs the line between Boruto and Momoshiki. And that's the intent behind it. It's to make the audience wonder, are you really dealing with Momoshiki or Boruto? Or is it a combination of both? Even Kawaki thought Momoshiki took over Boruto's mind again in chapter 64, only to realize that it was Boruto still in control when he spoke. Now, this is the part of the video where we are going to go over the different reasons why Momoshiki has not appeared in Two Blue Vortex. Chapter 72 has an interaction with Boruto and Momoshiki post-resurrection. Despite losing access to Boruto's body to resurrect fully in, Momoshiki had a backup plan. He wanted to make omnipotence come into reality. This would be a reality in which Boruto would lose everything. Momoshiki was counting on this to make Boruto lose his will to live and to take over Boruto's life forever. Boruto then proceeds to throw Momoshiki's words right back at him. Boruto says that if it's possible to shove someone into the recesses of his mind, that he was going to shove Momoshiki's mind into a corner and make sure that he never emerges again. And I believe this was foreshadowing for what happened in Two Blue Vortex. Boruto not using his karma seal for years and rejecting Momoshiki's power is what led him to pushing Momoshiki into the corner of his subconscious mind. Boruto may have unintentionally pulled an Uno reverse card on Momoshiki because, of course, this is something Momoshiki had intended to go the other way around. And this isn't even a one-off thing because Boruto brings this up again in chapter 80 of part 1. Boruto, just before leaving the Land of Fire with Sasuke, tells Momoshiki once again to stay backstage and stay silent for once. Even more evidence, in my opinion, that he pushed Momoshiki into the recesses of his mind out of his own subconscious desire to live his own life without the burden of Momoshiki. Boruto activating his karma very slowly in episode 1 of the series is also another indicator of this idea. What if the reason why he's activating his karma seal like this when he's about to fight Kawaki during that first scene of the series is that he doesn't want to allow Momoshiki to take center stage again, and he's refocusing his mind to keep Momoshiki at bay and deep within his subconscious. If he were to activate his karma seal quickly like he did in part 1, or even in chapter 9 of Two Blue Vortex when he experienced the karma resonance, then he would be at risk of losing control. This would also explain why Momoshiki did not take over Boruto's body in chapters 1 through 4 of Two Blue Vortex. He is trapped in a corner of Boruto's subconscious mind, likely deep within a slumber. But imagine if Momoshiki did indeed take over, then he would have won. Code and Kawaki were literally served to him on a silver platter. Momoshiki in Boruto's body would have at least been 20 times stronger than both of them put together. Heck, I even say 100 times stronger. He would have been able to capture Kawaki very easily since Kawaki was very weak at the time, and Code would have led him to the Ten Tails ultimately. Whether or not the Shinju would have manifested in the time frame of chapters 3 or 4 wouldn't matter in this case either, since Momoshiki would have just used Kawaki as an offering regardless. So thankfully that did not happen. So Boruto can willingly activate his karma seal at any time, but the consequence of that is Momoshiki would awaken and drift back into Boruto's conscious mind. And this was a possible future that Kashin Koji saw and averted by telling Boruto to flee from Kawaki in chapter 9. But you guys know me by now. One explanation just isn't enough. We need to look at other possibilities for why Momoshiki hasn't appeared in Two Blue Vortex as well. So what we learned from Boruto's own words is that after a year in exile with Sasuke, Boruto did not bother using his karma seal. He was set on just training as a shinobi and following Sasuke's path as a ninja. He also appears to have maintained his original personality from Boruto Part 1 when we see the flashback in Chapter 5 of Two Blue Vortex, which was very cheerful and optimistic. Boruto only used the Karma Seal again after an entire year in exile once he and Sasuke encountered Code and his Claw Grime. Interestingly enough, we only see the ending of the fight, not the beginning or even anything that happened in the middle of this fight. And I think that was for a good reason. They're holding off on a major reveal for one of the side effects of Boruto activating his karma. Boruto in chapter 15 of Two Blue Vortex said that it felt like he was dying while still being alive and that he ceased being himself. But what does that truly mean? So whatever happened to Boruto during that fight obviously was bad. So bad to the point that Boruto even had to deactivate his karma during the conclusion of that fight. But I think the side effects of him using karma against Code during his year in exile still remained. After Boruto and Sasuke's fight with Code, Boruto's personality changed very drastically. He's more threatening to people's lives and even was willing to cut off people's arms. So that's not really something in character for Boruto if you really think about it. The last time I checked, these were things that Boruto wouldn't say. I would actually associate a lot of Boruto's dialogue when he's violent with something Momoshiki would say. Now you could argue that his personality changing is due to his guilt for Sasuke getting turned into a tree and literally shouldering the fate of the entire world. But I'm just not buying it. Boruto has fought world-ending threats before and he didn't change this drastically in terms of his personality. I think it's the karma that changed him. It's probably just a coincidence as well, but I also find it interesting that Momoshiki worked as a pair with Kinshiki to bring forth the worst possible future in part 1, while Boruto is working as a pair with Kashin Koji in part 2 in order to prevent that same worst possible future. Kashin Koji and Kinshiki both have K's in their name and served as respective mentors for Momoshiki and Boruto. I believe Momoshiki's influence over Boruto is still active. Boruto is not going to condemn the world for the sake of power like Momoshiki would, but there's a bit of Momoshiki still in him as well, which would explain his aggression and assertiveness despite that never being present within Boruto's character prior to his fight with Code while he was in exile with Sasuke. So while Momoshiki may be in his subconscious mind and trapped, there still could be a little bit of his influence that has manifested to Boruto's conscious mind. Kawaki is very much so a hypocrite, and I think he's wrong about Boruto's true nature being that of a dangerous Otsutsuki who can go on a rampage at any moment. And since Boruto is working with Kashin Koji, they can literally anticipate any attempts of Momoshiki trying to take over Boruto's body and easily prevent it, since Koji could see into infinite possible futures and find different types of points to stop Momoshiki's rampages. But what if Boruto's change in personality was caused by the karma, since the intent behind karma in the first place was to replace Boruto with Momoshiki entirely? Maybe the more Boruto uses the karma as a 100% Otsutsuki who technically can't resurrect, that's what's changing his personality to be more like Momoshiki's. I think a perfect example to illustrate Boruto's current situation is with the character of Piccolo from the Dragon Ball franchise. Piccolo in his early days was a very mean and aggressive individual, and he slightly changed throughout the series early on because he befriended another character named Gohan, but the aggressiveness was still present. Now, when he fused with another character named Nail in a later arc, he had a drastic change in personality to reflect that. He went from being a very aggressive fighter to a more noble and peaceful warrior. Nail as a character ceased to exist as he faded into Piccolo's subconscious mind. However, Piccolo adopted the traits of another character. The same thing happened later on in the series when Piccolo fused with the other half of himself named Kami. After Piccolo fused with Kami, he went from being a very stoic individual to a lot more expressive and even goofy at times, which actually reflects Kami's personality more than Piccolo's. I believe this is what's currently happening with Boruto. So the third reason why Momoshiki may not have appeared in Two Blue Vortex may be because of Jura himself, and let me explain. So what do we know about Momoshiki? He's a very cocky character, but he's not stupid enough to pick fights he cannot win. Kashin Koji with prescience knows what Jura is capable of more than anyone else in the entire series, because he could see infinite possible futures that the Boruto story could take. He's likely seen many characters attempt to kill Jura only to fail miserably. Kashin Koji tells Boruto point blank, if you engage in combat with Jura, he is going to kill you. He was very absolute in saying this. Koji also tells the 8th Hokage not to provoke Jura. If he is angered in any way, there's absolutely no chance of winning. Jura would literally kill Boruto, Kawaki, Damon, or anyone else in the series without breaking a sweat. Despite Jura being a major issue, Koji is strategically setting up a playing field to eventually take Jura's Thorn Soul Bulb. Jura has to be defeated to prevent the Darkest Timeline from ever being a possible future that could occur. Once that happens, the Shinju as a whole would cease to exist, and the original Ten Tails should, in theory, manifest again. Which at that point, Boruto and Koji should be able to easily get rid of the original Ten Tails. And this may be a point where Momoshiki actually comes back and takes over again. And here's why I say that. In part 1, Momoshiki used a similar tactic. He did not intervene when Ishiki fought against Naruto and Sasuke. It was only after Ishiki's death that he saw a golden opportunity to take over Boruto's body. Why wouldn't he do the same for Jura and the other Shinju when they are a far bigger threat than Ishiki? And this may sound a little unorthodox, but I actually like the idea of Momoshiki never showing up, but always still being a threat. We've seen Momoshiki take over Boruto several times in Boruto Part 1, and we are already aware of his goals. I think it's a lot more impactful to have the idea of Momoshiki emerging constantly being an obstacle for Boruto to prevent, rather than him actually showing up. From an audience standpoint as well, it builds up a lot more interest and suspense for how terrifying Momoshiki could be. Whatever we build up in our heads about Momoshiki is always going to be more impactful than what we would actually see. It would just make for better writing, in my opinion. Which leads me to my next point. The ending of chapter 80 sets up Boruto's character arc in Two Blue Vortex perfectly. Up until his time in exile, Boruto has been labeled an Otsutsuki, someone who needs to be sacrificed to the Ten Tails, someone who is a danger to society, someone who is a menace to society, someone who needs to be killed, and someone who has literally nothing and no one in his corner. Sasuke tells Boruto that Naruto went through very similar circumstances as the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki. He too started with nothing, but became Hokage by proving himself through his actions. The world sees Boruto Otsutsuki, but now it's up to Boruto to show the world that he's Boruto Uzumaki. Boruto in Two Blue Vortex is not only fighting for the entire world, he is also facing a recurring theme of his identity. But despite what the world thinks of him, he has the blood of the 7th Hokage flowing within him. He has the blood of the Hyuga clan. His grandfather is the 4th Hokage, and most importantly, he carries the will of fire as a ninja. And Boruto's identity is what pushes him to be the best version of himself and reach new heights. It's shown throughout his jutsu as the future versions of him have invented very unique and impressive techniques. Boruto's space-time ninjutsu is literally based on and named after his grandfather's flying Raijin and incorporates symbols of different aspects of Boruto's own personal life. The leaf symbol representing his home, the bolt representing his name and his appearance in Naruto chapter 700, the Uzumaki symbol showing his household and his clan, the sun pattern indicating that he's Mitsuki's son, and finally his karma seal because he's also an Otsutsuki. Boruto's Rasengan Uzuhiko is very similar to the Flying Raijin in the sense where it also takes aspects of his family's history. The Earth's rotation and the chakra manipulated by wind style is obviously referencing the Rasengan and the Hyuga clan's rotation technique as well. So even though Momoshiki is a part of him, and even if he appears again, or maybe he doesn't appear again, it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, Boruto has the power to decide his own fate and make his story go the way he wants it to be.